continuing to move into the issues of play, I talked about heroism and morality. There's an interesting contrast among the games of that time. Villains and Vigilantes and DC Heroes are very, very straightforward. Villains are criminals. They break the law. And heroes uphold the law. They may do so from different motivations, but there's no question whatsoever that society is effectively stable and criminals are bad in it, and you are helping against those criminals. Villains and Vigilantes of this era even includes the New York Penal Code, verbatim, as your guide for your heroic priorities. So we can also look at what I call the immoral superhero games. Marvel Superheroes is a fantastic example in which there is a morality system, but it is very flexible in terms of how you're going to address it. To be a effectively, do wrong a fair amount of the time kind of superhero is possible with an awareness of how the system works. Again, it's not breaking it. I actually think that Jeff Grubb knew exactly what he was doing and was focusing on the variety of Marvel characters at that time, or that he had been exposed to until that time. Most of the people you're up against are people who are bonkers. They are causing problems not because they disagree with the law, but because they are nuts. So then we look at what I'm thinking of as the amoral superhero games. People get confused. They say, oh, so you're supposed to be amoral? No. I'm saying the game system is not taking sides. And for Champions and then GURP Supers, which was heavily influenced by Champions, the world around us with its politics and its problems and its people and the differing opinions give rise to emergent problems, emergent crisis. So you don't really necessarily have a bad person doing a bad thing, and so badness is introduced into a world. You typically will see that in a larger context. And again, how your hero decides to do it is extraordinarily personal for you as a player, and is also unpredictable in terms of how it's going to turn out. To contrast, DC Heroes is very explicit. The villains lose. They just do. I mean, if the villain don't lose, you're playing it wrong. And here in Champions and GURP Supers just shrug and say, hey man, your table. Now, to clarify as to why I went into this detail, I really want to emphasize that the people who made all of these games had grown up on and were, for lack of a better word, imbued with the comics that I'm talking about, in which Spider-Man is openly suicidal. I mean, I learned, I should just go home and cut my throat tonight from Spider-Man. Before you start talking about Spider-Man as the noble. No, he wasn't. He almost beats a rapist to death in one of the issues. There's all kinds of things. I mean, I learned about dirty needles and heroin from Daredevil. I learned about paranoid schizophrenia, duodenal ulcers, full psychotic breakdown, and the proper name, lysergic acid diethylamide. I learned all of these from the comics off the newsstands. I learned about, unmarried relationship hassles. I learned about, this was really a look. Richard Nixon shoots himself in the head in front of Captain America. These are comics that really are not well appreciated today. I want to focus on how these games knew about this. And I was just focusing on societal content and stuff. I want to focus on something else. They were not franchise characters in the sense of being editorially scrutinized for where they were going to go next. They didn't have huge stories that were planned and orchestrated and sort of composed like a mission to Mars and then laid out like clockwork, bam, 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 bam. And then, no, those huge stories sprawled and went from title to title, mainly because somebody was taken off of a given title. And then they said, well, I like that story I'm working on. So then the comic that I am doing, then the hero from that other comic is going to show up in it. And we're just going to continue that story over there. And you had people who were basically partying together, writing different books, and they'd come back and write comics based on what they'd riffed on with each other. So the characters would cross over that way. It was very unconstructed, very uncontrolled, and nobody knew where the character was going. The notion that the character would change. Steve Rogers quit being Captain America and became Nomad. And as far as I can tell, that was intended by the writer to be a permanent move and was only reversed when, actually it was during a certain period that I talked about historically a bit ago. I won't go into it. What's important is that there was nobody saying to any of the writers, make him go this way and do this, and then we'll bring it back around. It's not like the death of Superman so many years later, where it was all known where all of this was going. And so people just wrote forward. A lot of characters that you think of as longstanding were killed during that period, and they weren't written to come back. They were brought back, 10 years, 15 years later. They were supposed to be waxed in that story. So I really want to focus on that aspect of the comics. We knew that we were writing, that they were being written forward that way. We had publications like Foom, where the writers and editors are talking very frankly about this stuff. We knew that the comics were free to go where they would. We didn't know how limited that would be in time, but that was our experience. And that factors directly into these games. When you play this game, you are Chris Claremont. Chris Claremont started writing for Marvel, I think before he was in his 20s. Jerry Conway took over Spider-Man at 19. And you are handed this title and maybe like draw on a few of the existing characters and, a couple of beta characters or one-time appearance only characters. And you make up a couple new ones, and this is your superhero team, and go. And, the editors are either completely laissez-faire or they're distracted with God knows what at the time. And what's the story going to be? Right forward. It's incredible. So that's the experience of the comics that we had, and the games show it. Make your comic. Do as you will. Make what you want. Here are rules that will turn it dynamic. Rules that will generate consequence. And when the points roll in, you get to see how that consequence is going to change your hero. This is a big deal. And it, frankly, died as popular culture. So we had heroes without franchises. Once it becomes a franchise, it's subordinated to other products, toys, movies. We don't care what happens in the comics. We care about who will play Batman next. Comics at that time were effectively underground media. They were completely connected. The same people who were doing underground comics, with all the boobs and the sex and drugs and stuff. There was a lot of crossover with the creators I'm talking about and that underground media. You will be surprised to see some of the people who are working with Marvel on materials. People, who S. Clay Wilson was doing work with Marvel at that time. People in the comics that about were, happily doing weird underground stuff on the side as well. The integration with rock music, just at the birth of heavy metal, the birth of prog, the wild scene in which the bands that we know took shape. All of that's deeply integrated with comics. Frank Zappa and Jack Kirby were friends. So it's all connected, right? The art, the album covers are practically comics. The comics are practically album covers. Um, these are quite something. You can also look at science fiction and fantasy, which, as you know, underwent an incredible transformation in the late 60s. And everybody who did that kind of stories, Roger Zelazny is an excellent example. Role-playing, comics, and science fiction prose publishing and music are all the same thing. Michael Moorcock, another phenomenal example for this, and it just goes on and on of this complete experiential overlap. And it's all junk, right? I mean, tons of junk, but we know that when nobody's looking, you find treasure in there. You made some of it and you find some of it. It's really much more appropriate to think of comics at this time as having more in common with street art than with comics as a product that you buy as part of your enjoyment of Batman as a cultural presence. I suggest that there is a discontinuity between the end of this existence for superheroes and what came after. That it's not just a death, it's a murder. The editorial shifts that we saw may have been very good corporate sense, but they are discontinuous shifts about how these comics are going to be made from now on, what kind of editorial meetings we're going to have from now on, the way we look at upcoming property releases like a new line of toys or a new movie coming out, and then how the comics are going to support that. Those shifts are extraordinarily clear. They are discontinuous. It's not just the way it turned out. So that's what happened to our pop superheroes. There was some struggles. Comics creators are a notoriously dubious lot who never obey, and so you can find on and off sort of struggles to recover this, or struggles to do it again, or struggles to keep doing it. And I'm talking specifically with superheroes. You can see that pop in and out, throughout the history, although recent history. I mean, once the mouse is involved, I don't know how much of that kicking in the traces will ever happen again with those characters. Anyway, so that's what happened. Pop superheroes were effectively dead and buried. Buried meaning not acknowledged. Superhero role-playing. Am I going to be so cruel as to say it too is dead and buried as of the appearance of the Hero System in 1989? And arguably, I could be quite that blunt and say, yeah, kinda. It used to be that your game was your comics title going forward. It was full of situational and identity crisis. You could see this hero living in circumstances that you can relate to. It may not be you, but this is someone that could be. Even if they were an alien, even if they were a robot or whatever, you get it. The setting, Earth Now is a term that was used in a much later game that absolutely beautifully captured what the games of that time were doing. You didn't have a canonical setting. You didn't have mascot characters. You could point to the licensed one, Marvel and DC. These definitely had that, but I'm talking more about champions and villains and vigilantes. Also, I will argue that the first versions of Marvel superheroes and DC heroes were much more open about what you were going to do relative to the universes, which at that time were basically just being licked into shape anyway. But there was very little fictional specifications of what the setting was like, aside from the fact that, it already. After that, throw in what you want. Yeah, okay, half the people are lizards, or, there's Atlanteans or whatever. Enjoy, right? But we're setting this with what we know. That when you customized, it had consequences. The powers lists in the rules are not the same as lists of powers that characters can have. That's a critical point. The powers lists are mechanical facilitations such that you will end up with the powers that the character has, and that driving change is essential to play. That you can't just play your guy over and over and over again. No, things are going on and the points roll in, or the rolls that change, things happen, or they did this thing. Now what? This happened because of what they did. Now what? The feel of play, which is the same as the feel of reading the next issue of that comic, because you don't know where it's going, and the writer barely does. They are treating it as a wave front themselves, maybe a little ahead of the reader in terms of publication, but as an experience, they're going, what is going to happen with this person, this group? I don't know. I'm working on it. We're finding out. So these features is what I am saying were killed. And that's what I'm doing, is saying, I was there. I'm not dead. We're doing it now.